Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, when we discuss early war Axis aggression, we rarely include the threat to what was then Palestine. Ally Abandon is a new book on this fascinating part of the war. From the Great War through to the Arab Revolt, we look at the Anglo-Jewish relationship and the extraordinary sequence of events in the Middle East. And the links to purchasing the book are in the description below. I'll bring the author in now. Good evening, Geoffrey. How are you today?
Good evening. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. So we were just chatting there that I love it when we tackle a subject that isn't one that we've really explored before. And lots of aspects to this that have sinews across the war. But before we get into your presentation, just give our audience a bit of an idea of your background, because you've done non-fiction, you've done fiction, you've taught and learned and educated in different places. So explain a bit about your background, please.
Yeah, my profession is an accountant. I did my degree in accountancy and economics, but it was history was always in my heart, if you like. So that was always the favorite subject at school, and it was always the thing that I read about for pleasure and leisure. To the extent that it was about 10 years ago, I saw an advert for Buckingham University. They were doing masters in history, masters by research, and I just thought, wow, that's exactly what I want to do. And then, of course, I had to think of something to do the masters on, and everybody seemed to be choosing Waterloo or Arnhem or whatever. And I thought, well, try and look for something different. And I hit upon Palestine because I knew quite a lot about that subject from reading and from visits to the region. But I didn't really know about World War II in Palestine, and realized that actually not a lot of people did. And in fact, there was even one writer said that the Arab-Israel conflict that started with the First World War up to 1939, then there was a pause for the Second World War, and then it resumed afterwards, as if nothing actually happened. Everyone was just took a back seat during the Second World War. And I didn't think that was right. So I started investigating, and this is the result.
It's the result. And, there's one of the things we've discussed a lot on this is a perceived threat may not necessarily come through to what you're expecting, but it doesn't mean it isn't a very serious situation. And there's lots of people who are in 41, 42, worried about what was happening in the neighboring country, or what was going to be the empire to their left, right, north, or what was going to do to them. And I think that's very much the situation here. And then that, of course, how the British government were involved in it. So I'll bring up your slide. So, folks, I feel that you're not going to have too many questions on this one, but it doesn't mean we won't answer if we can. But I'm going to hand over to Geoffrey to take us through this, and we start at the Great War and go the right way through. And then, as I said, folks, in the description, this is part one. There'll be a part two following where we carry on the story later on. But right now, I'm going to hand over to Geoffrey to take us through this. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, so I've decided to start with Gallipoli, 1915. And I think that's probably where the modern story of the Middle East starts, because it's at that point when the British are struggling at Gallipoli that they look to further unorthodox measures that might help them in their struggle against Turkey. And they turn to Sheriff Hussein, who is an Arab leader in Mecca. The Hashemite family, he's from the Hashemites, and they've had hundreds of years in control of Mecca and Medina. And he there's a series of letters between the High Commissioner of Egypt, McMahon, and Sheriff Hussein, promising all sorts of independence. It's a bit vague what the promises are and exactly where they're promising independence, but Arab independence in return for an Arab revolt against the Turks, which duly takes place. And that's, probably people have heard of it through Lawrence of Arabia, who gets involved at that point. The British also are in trouble in 1917. There's the Russian Revolution, the first one in February 1917, which doesn't knock Russia out the war, but it's making Britain very worried that that's about to happen. And the bottom picture there, the French army mutinies of 1917 makes things seem a bit wobbly, and the British in their desperation then start making promises to the Jews also about Palestine, and why that is I'll come into. But so from 1915, I think there is an Arab revolt that starts around 1916. Interestingly, it doesn't stop the British with all these promises making a secret pact between France, Britain, and Russia in 1916, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they were going to divide up the region into their own spheres. So the red is under British protection, blue is under French protection, and Russia, Britain, and France will have the northern part of what is today Israel. The British are very interested in, of course, having something as a buffer to protect against the Suez Canal. And they think Haifa port is of supreme importance. And you can see there's a little British direct enclave there. And the French are going to have a direct enclave over the areas now in Lebanon, which was the Maronite Christian areas in Lebanon, which was very much the French saw themselves as champions of them. By 1917, though, Russia is out of the war, so the Sykes-Picot would be between France and Britain. But as British armies are getting involved in the Middle East and the French aren't, then Britain's beginning to think, well, do we really have to give so much to France? Maybe we can keep more for ourselves. And that's one of the reasons for the promises to the Jews, which is the Balfour Declaration, which I show here from November 1917. So one of the reasons then is that if the French are championing the Christians in Lebanon, and that gives them sole control over Lebanon, well, maybe we can have sole control over Palestine if we can champion the Jews. The other reason is actually, although Arthur Balfour, who had been a prime minister and was now the foreign secretary, and Lloyd George, the current prime minister, they all had some affinity to the Jews because they'd been brought up in the Bible, but they also betrayed anti-Jewish prejudice in that they had this unrealistic view of Jewish power and what Jews could help them with. Partly, I suppose, it was because of desperation with what was going on in 1917. By November 1917, when the declaration is issued, Russia is pretty much already out of the war. But Lloyd George still hopes that the Jewish influence in Russia, there is no Jewish influence in Russia, but he hopes that what it will do, that the Jews and the Bolshevik party will be able to keep a cold peace between Russia and Germany, and they won't be able to supply Germany with the raw materials that Germany needs for the war. 20 years later, and we'll come to the Peel Commission, but Lloyd George is brought before the Peel Commission as a secret witness. Well, not a secret witness, but he has a public testimony and a secret testimony. And in that secret testimony, he said, Bolshevik Zionists, a Jew's a Jew, doesn't matter, they're all the same. And of course, the Zionists and the Bolsheviks, Jews, would have been at each other's throats. They did not eye to eye and were never going to help each other. It was just ridiculous. As was the other illusion of Jewish power, which was that the Jewish community in the United States would be able to bring the United States into the war. The Jews in the United States were first-generation immigrants, maybe second generation. They hadn't really fully established themselves, and they were facing anti-Semitism in America anyway. They were certainly not able to deliver on that promise either. But nevertheless, the Balfour Declaration recognizes both Jewish and Arab local rights to the land, and that's the first time that this has happened. At that time, about 12% of the population is Jewish. The rest is Arab, mainly Muslim, a small Christian minority as well. And moving on to the next slide, it's not enough. The Balfour Declaration lays the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine, but it can't make it happen. There's about 80,000 Jews in Palestine at the time. It had temporarily gone down because of Turkish expulsions, but then it came back after the war. And what makes the Jewish national home a reality isn't the Balfour Declaration, it's anti-Semitism in Europe, and followed by quotas and anti-Semitism in the United States. And I thought the best way of showing this would be this cartoon, which is from a paper in Philadelphia in April 1921. And it shows this guy is labeled the employer of cheap labor. And he is rushing with joy towards a wave of immigration. And his wife, named Sentimentality, is smiling and holding his hand. But they've got a little kid who's bawling his eyes out, and he's the future of America. And he's crying because he can see beyond the immigration wave. And he sees that there's lowered standards, race degeneration, Bolshevism, and disease. And indeed, the Americans are going through this wave of pulling up the drawbridge. They've forgotten about the Native Americans. They see themselves as the true Americans. They are white Americans. They are Protestant Americans, and they don't want anything else soiling their America. So 1921, they put the first quotas in, and then it's tightened up again in 1924. And the numbers here show the impact. But before I get to that, what is driving Jews away from their homes anyway? And that you can see on the top left of this slide. Enormous hatred of Jews is the chaos of the First World War has generated a new outbreak of anti-Semitism as old countries are destroyed, borders are fluid, law and order breaks down. And you can see here quite appalling figures that it's only because of the Second World War Holocaust that it's less known that 250,000 Jews are killed in the end of the First World War in the early 20s, killed, starved to death in Ukraine. And that's just when you don't, as a Jew, really want the USA, who had, if you remember the words of the Statue of Liberty, bring me your huddled masses yearning to be free. And you don't want to find suddenly America is now changing its mind. So 120,000 Jews on the top right of this slide, 120,000 Jews came into America in 1921. Only 9,000 go to Palestine. I couldn't find year-by-year breakdown for the next 3 years, but if we average them out, 50,000 a year Jews coming into the USA after the first quotas, so down from 120,000 a year, and 30,000 a year, 10,000 a year to Palestine, if you divide that by 3. When the quotas are tightened up in 1925, only 10,000 Jews make it to the United States. Now it's flipped, 34,000 to Palestine. And what that means, if you add up over those, the first half of the 1920s, you've got about 74,000, 73,000 Jews coming to Palestine, which almost doubles the numbers there. And that is going to cause pressure in Palestine, but it does mean that the Jewish national home is now becoming a reality with maybe 160,000 Jews there now.
Gary asked a minute ago, as the population of Jews in Palestine increases, where are they particularly located within Palestine? Because it's quite a big country. I mean, I'm assuming that might come out a bit later on, but I mean, there are obviously centers of where they tend to settle.
Yeah, so Palestine's actually a very small country. It's about, well, I won't get caught into what it is because it hasn't yet been defined by the British mandate, which will make the borders a little easier, but they're very fluid at that moment. The Jews are moving to the kibbutz. Everyone will have heard of that. It's a communal settlement. It's a very socialist lookout on life, where everything is communal, everything is shared. They don't have their own money. Everything is put in a pot. It is socialism as it's supposed to be, if you like. And these communal settlements, agricultural settlements, dot the country, mainly in the Galilee region, where Jewish immigrants are battling swamps, malaria, but also on the coastal plain. Jaffa is one of the biggest towns in it up until that point. But in 1909, the first immigrants put the foundations to Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv becomes the first Jewish city since Bible times. And the population rapidly increases in Tel Aviv, so that by the 1930s, it has dwarfed Jaffa. And at one point, it becomes known as Tel Aviv Jaffa, but later it's just Tel Aviv because Jaffa is so small compared to Tel Aviv. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Another question from Michael, which he was obviously wanted the answer very much because he posted it 3 times. Given the Sykes-Picot Agreement called for the international zone in the Holy Land, what were the responses of France and Italy to the Balfour direction? Italy in no position with Caporetto. I mean, this may be something that's coming up later on, but I like it when a well-informed question comes in earlier. So is there something you want to say about that?
So Italy, I think, would be disappointed generally with what happens at Versailles. They're given very little compared to what they hoped. And they went into the war to hope for all sorts of territories, mainly on the Dalmatian coast and in a bit of North Africa. They weren't particularly interested in Palestine. The French, again, we will see, because as the mandates are allocated to the former Ottoman territories, the French get Syria and Lebanon. So they're not too disappointed that the British get Palestine and Iraq. So it's sort of a fair division of the spoils, as they would see it.
Okay, thank you. Back to you then, sir.
Okay, so the effect of all that immigration from the anti-Semitism of the 20s means that the Jewish population goes from about 12% to about 17%. What then changes and moves the needle again is what happens in the 1930s. And what you see here is Jews of Berlin desperately queuing at the Palestine and Orient Travel Company, desperate to get visas to Palestine in the Nazi period before the Holocaust is kicked off. So in the 30s, the Nazis haven't yet decided that mass murder is their solution to the Jewish problem as they see it. They think get rid of the Jews. And the Jews, but they don't make it easy. They impoverish them. They take all their property first. And that's why these people are desperate for visas, and they will have to give up most of their houses and whatever savings they have to get there. And that, of course, causes a spike in immigration to Palestine. But it's not just coming from Germany. It's also from Poland and Romania, where, again, right-wing governments have taken power, and they're also beginning to kick the Jews out. So if Europe today is looking at saying, well, what's all this going on in the Middle East, you could say Europe is actually chiefly to blame for it. And I think maybe this will put things in perspective. This graph I've created here shows that the columns at the bottom, the green columns, are Jewish immigration to Palestine every year from 1920 to the outbreak of the Second World War. And you can see that there is a spike in the 1930s, and each year, subsequent year, beats the previous records. And if you just add up those 4 years together, it's about 160, 170,000 just in those years, which again doubles the number of Jews to Palestine. And this blue line shows the cumulative number of Jews in Palestine. So around 80,000 at the end of the First World War. During the 20s, it's roughly creeping up to 17, but the really steep increases in the 1930s, and it reaches, on the eve of the Second World War, it's getting to around 450,000. And Tel Aviv is now a city of about 170,000. So enormous increases, and of course that puts pressure on the Arabs. The Arabs had 600,000 Arabs in Palestine, in around, depending how you count Palestine, fluid borders, remember, but around 600,000 at the end of the First World War. And they're also immigrating to Palestine, but because they, paradoxically, as Jewish economic wealth floods in, it creates more wealth for the general population. And so tens of thousands, I would say, of Arabs also move into Palestine, chasing economic benefits. But the largest increase is natural growth for the Arabs. And again, as medical conditions improve, hospitals are being built as part of the Jewish National Home. The Arabs benefit, the death rate goes down. So the Arab population, over this 25-year period from 1918 to 20-year period to 1939, both populations increased by about 400,000. So what that means is that by 1939, the Arab population is about 1 million, and the Jews is about 500,000. But in percentage terms, if you quickly do the maths, it means that they've now hit 30%. And that's worrying to a lot of the Arabs. And in 1936, the Arab revolt breaks out. It lasts for about 3 years, and it isn't just about immigration, although, of course, that is a major driver. The leader of the Palestinian Arab community is very anti-Semitic. His name is Haj Amin al-Husseini, and he is urging. He didn't actually instigate the Arab revolt, but he piggybacked onto it. The other reasons for the Arab revolt is the influence of Mussolini's Italy. They have a colony in Italian East Africa. They also have Libya. And in 1935, they invade Abyssinia, Ethiopia. And so there's two Italian-based reasons for the revolt. One is the incitement through the radio, newspapers. Italy is continually trying to raise the Arabs up against the British in just to be mischievous, really. And also there's a face-off between Britain and Italy over Abyssinia in 1935, where Britain puts its foot down and says, you're not going to have it. But when Italy ignores them, and the League of Nations is shown to be toothless, and Britain does nothing in the end, it doesn't take any military action or military steps. And it certainly was commented on the time that this showed British weakness to the Arabs in the Middle East. It's, they had been all powerful, and now suddenly they're letting Italy get the better of them. And so it gives the Arabs some hope that they might be able to throw off the British yoke as they see it in not only Egypt, but also in Palestine and Iraq. Iraq had an anti-British revolt, an anti-French revolt as well in the 1920s when the mandates had been allocated. And I should say that the mandates for the British mandate for Palestine, as early as 1921, shortly after it had been granted, Churchill, who was the colonial secretary at the time, he wants to reward the son of Sheriff Hussein, and gives them two sons. He gives one the kingdom of Iraq and the other the kingdom of Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, known then as Transjordan. And he hives off the eastern part of the Palestine mandate. So everything east of the River Jordan becomes Transjordan, and much to Jewish disappointment, what they hoped would be their Jewish national home just becomes less than half of what they hoped in 1917. But for the Palestinian Arabs, of course, if they're on the west side of the Jordan, they still have this Jewish immigration to deal with. So moving on, the British, when they are faced with a revolt like the Arab one of 1936, they think, right, we need a commission quickly. So they appoint Lord Peel, and he comes up with a very detailed report. It's really worth a read. They went into a lot of detail about life in Palestine, statistics going on in the 30s and where they had come. It reviews the path of history since the First World War, and it comes to the conclusion that the only way these communities are going to be able to live in peace side by side is to partition the land. And what you see here is about more than 2/3 of it is going to become an Arab state. Less than a third where the main Jewish kibbutzim and the town of Tel Aviv, Jaffa, is there. And you can see they'll be in a Jewish state. You can see the green area where the British want Jaffa port, and they also want Jerusalem with the holy sites. They feel that they should be still in control of those until the two sides learn how to live together.
Fascinating, isn't it, Geoffrey, how whenever these decisions are being made, there's always that importance of having a link to the sea. I'm thinking of places like Danzig and things like that. Yeah. As you go across the world, there's always that, but we need access to the sea.
Yes.
Which I understand, but it always makes these maps that much more complicated to sort out because of those sorts of basic needs.
And I think, and the British are still hoping that overall they'll still have overall control. So there's a lot of discussion within the Jewish community, and I'll start calling it the Yishuv from now on, because to say the Palestinian Jewish community is a bit of a mouthful. In the Jews refer to themselves as the Yishuv, and they think this is too small for them because they've got all these Jews desperate to flee Europe. They need somewhere to put them, and they don't think that this orange area is militarily defensible when surrounded by Arabs in Syria, Lebanon, and Transjordan, as well as the new Palestine state. But they do in the end decide, because they're up against it, because Jews are fleeing for their lives everywhere, they say, okay, we'll accept it. The Arabs reject it because they want a single Arab state. They don't want to share it with anybody. And they see that other Arab states are all getting independence and they want the same for themselves. The British had hoped, the Colonial Office in particular had hoped that there would be an agreement. And when they saw there wasn't, they think, well, maybe we should enforce it anyway. But the Foreign Office is now, for the first time, beginning to have its voice heard, because the Foreign Office has not been in the Middle East until recently. But with Egypt independent, and now the Emirate of Transjordan, as it was called, getting semi-independence, Iraq getting a treaty in the 1930s, the Foreign Office is now thinking about these countries, and of course Saudi Arabia, which is independent, having kicked out Sheriff Hussein and renamed the Hejaz as Saudi Arabia under Ibn Saud. And the British are now thinking, well, we need to take what they called it pan-Arabism. They need to take into account all the Arab views, and what happens if we upset all the Arabs just when there's a war coming in Europe. And the Foreign Office thinks maybe we should scrap partition. Maybe we've got to appease the Arabs rather like we're appeasing the Italians and the Germans. If we are going to have a war in Europe, and they're only thinking in European terms at that point, they can't think of a world war. But if there's a European war, we don't want trouble in the Middle East. we are going to, as Chamberlain said in a cabinet meeting in 1939, if we have to upset one side, let it be the Jews, not the Arabs, because they know the Jews are never going to side with the Nazis. So they're always going to have the Jews on their side, whatever they do. But the Arabs, they don't know which way the Arabs are going to go. So, and they know that the Arabs might be influenced by the Italian propaganda. What we've got to do is appease the Arabs. So they come up with a new white paper. So the Churchill one in 1921 hived off Transjordan. There's a new white paper known as the MacDonald White Paper that comes out in May 1939. And it is offering the Arabs one single state in Palestine with a permanent Jewish minority. So the Arabs will have, because the current population is about 2/3 Arab, 1/3 Jewish, you will have an Arab state with an Arab majority. And that will happen in 10 years' time. But from 1939 to 1949, you will gradually be given more and more powers so that you're ready for independence. The Jews are allowed immigration of just 10,000 a year. So that's a heavy cap on what had been unlimited up until that point, nearly unlimited. For the next 5 years, from 1939 to 44, you as Jews can have 10,000 a year. And then as a solution, a contribution to solving the overall refugee problem that's going on in Europe, we'll give you another 25,000 at the High Commissioner's discretion during that 5 years. So you'll have 75,000. That will bring you up to 1/3 of the population, and then no more. And there's also heavy restrictions on what land sales can be made to the Jews, because the Jewish communities that we've talked about have always been on land that had been purchased until then from the Arabs. And that had caused a lot of upset in Palestine, because a lot of the Arab landlords who owned the land didn't live on the land. So they were selling land over the heads of the tenant farmers, which was causing upset. So now they're going to say, well, the Jews, you can only buy in certain areas. And this is coming just at the end of the Arab revolt. And some British, like General Haining, for example, who was the Vice Imperial Chief of Staff, he was saying, hang on, we've just beaten the Arabs and now we're going to give them something. It's like rewarding them for their revolt. That's not good. We shouldn't be doing that. Others in the spirit of appeasement saying, this is exactly what we should be doing. We should be giving them this and saying, right, we've given this to you. Now we expect you to behave, and we certainly don't expect you to not be loyal to us in any oncoming war. They expect there'll be Jewish reaction, negative reaction to the white paper. And here is a picture of a march from July 1939 in Tel Aviv. The banner there in the middle says, we will tear up the evil decree of the white paper, because what the Jews are seeing is that you British gave us a promise. On the basis of that promise, you've transported 500,000 of us into this place, and now you're just going to abandon us to an Arab majority, where we know that the Grand Mufti Husseini has already said he wants to kill all of us. So this isn't a great idea. And we are your only friends in the Middle East in this oncoming war, and you should treat us better. But the British know that this reaction is, in the end, going to die down, because when the chips are down, the Jews have to support Britain. And sure enough, when war breaks out in 1939, so just 3 months after these marches and demonstrations and strikes in the Yishuv, 136,000 of 500,000, which is a huge proportion, all sign up for British war service, or war service of one type or another. So that might be local defense, local industries, whatever it can do to help Britain win the war. And here are some Palestinian Jewish, or Yishuv, enlistment posters for the British Army in the Second World War. I've translated what the Hebrew says. Defend your homeland, enlist is the first one. And it's your turn is actually written in English there, join the ATS. And another female one, come join us for help with the victory. So the white paper, in fact, Ben Gurion, who is the leader of the Yishuv inside Palestine, as opposed to Weizmann, who's the broader leader outside Palestine, Ben Gurion says, we will fight the white paper of 1939 as if there is no war, and we will fight the war as if there's no white paper. So they will support the British as much as they can, but they still really want the British to lighten up on the immigration restrictions, because Jews are desperate more than ever. And the other thing the Jews do once war breaks out in Palestine is they lobby in London under their leader Chaim Weizmann, and they lobby for a Jewish division that will fight alongside the British under its own flag. And they want this for two reasons. One, because they want to beat the Nazis and they want to support the British. But two, they're also thinking about what happened in the First World War when a Jewish legion did form up in the British Army. Ben Gurion himself had been a soldier. A lot of people had enlisted into this Jewish legion from America, but they'd all fought under British colours. And they felt that had given them a voice at the peace conference at the end of the First World War. Maybe this time it will give them a voice as Britain's only ally in the Middle East at the end of the European war, as they saw it as well. But the British are alive to that, and they're saying, no, all you want is a Jewish state. And we've just said, we're not going to give you a Jewish state. We're not even going to, we've put a freeze on the Jewish national home right now. Who knows what the future will be, but we can't afford to upset the Arabs now, so you can't have a Jewish division. And in fact, we got, this is under Chamberlain, of course, but in May 1940, there's a new prime minister. And Churchill had been a huge supporter of the idea of a Jewish national home. He had been one of the initiators, instigators of the original Balfour Declaration in 1917. And he had spoken up against the White Paper of 1939 in the House of Commons. So the Jews are really hoping that now they will be able to fight and be acknowledged. And of course, from May 1940, Britain is standing alone, and the Jews are saying, well, you're not actually alone. We're still here, and we'll support you. But the colonial secretary, and I always find it hard to say Lord George Lloyd, but I've managed to say it this time without saying Lloyd George, but Lord George Lloyd is the colonial secretary, and he and Anthony Eden are very much opposed to any idea of a Jewish division. But what Churchill's most interested in May 1940 is not Palestine, obviously. He's more worried about what's happening in France. And when it looks like the British army is not going to make it out of France, he's desperate to get soldiers back into Britain to defend Britain. And he knows that there are quite a lot of British soldiers, 20,000 are in Palestine, garrisoning the place. And he says, I don't know if you can read this quote, but it says, I think it is little less than a scandal that at a time we are fighting for our lives, these very large forces should be immobilized in support of a policy, i.e. the White Paper, which only commends itself to a small portion of the Conservative Party. And he says, sorry,
I was going to say, is this like going back to 1915, 1916, where, because by this point, 1940, war clouds have absolutely broken out in torrential downpour, short-term thinking starts replacing sort of long-term thinking, because Churchill, as you say, he's thinking about what's going to happen next week, what's going to happen in France, what's going to happen, whereas maybe up until 1939 with the White Paper and whatever, people are thinking about 10 years down the line, and people are thinking maybe about 20 or 30 years down the line. And the same kind of things are happening. We did a show with Dear Gupta recently about India, in that there's people wanting a short term, but the Japanese are just over there thinking to what will India be like in 10 years time. And it's that sort of contradiction in a sense of what people are wanting, the long-term strategies compared to short-term.
Yeah, and absolutely, as we'll see, the people begin to see the White Paper in new light from middle of 1940, when they realised, hang on, this just doesn't hold up anymore. All the certainties have been thrown away. But what Churchill wants to do is he's saying, well, look, the Jews will be massacred if the British army leaves Palestine, but I have to have the troops. So what we should do is arm the Jews in Palestine so they can defend themselves. And Anthony Eden is very much against this because he thinks it'll upset the Arabs. Churchill is saying we must arm the Jews so that we can get the British troops out of there. And the argument goes on, but it changes because at the end of May 1940, the British army does get out of Dunkirk. And the pressure to get British troops, another 20,000 British troops lightly armed in Britain, isn't so important anymore. And the other huge event happens in June 1940, which is that Italy joins in. Yeah. And suddenly there's a new threat to Egypt. And they're thinking, hang on, those 20,000 troops in Palestine, keep them there. We might need them right where they are. And in fact, Italy does invade Egypt from Libya. And they, I think it's September 1940, they advance about 65 miles into Egypt, and then they start digging in, but no one knows how long for. The Italians vastly outnumber the British troops in Egypt, and that is a real threat. And there is also an invasion of British Somaliland from Abyssinia and from Italian East Africa. So and you can actually just see at the very bottom of this newspaper, it says there's a little story there: defences of canal found inadequate, and that's exactly what Britain's worried about, the Suez Canal. It also means that the Mediterranean is no longer safe for two reasons. The Italian Navy is very powerful and it's in the Mediterranean. And secondly, Britain hadn't really been thinking it would need to defend the Mediterranean in any war because it thought France was going to do that. And now France is out of the war. So,
yeah. And Rob Crane just made the point, suddenly a Vichy French country right on the border too. I mean, the situation is changing a lot. I mean, and Stuart Burbridge made the comment earlier about all the British yeomanry cavalry units in Palestine in 1939-40, which the regimental histories basically say are their training. And they are, of course, but they're also there as part of this whole posturing and making a presence be known. And this, there's a lot more going on than just, oh, we'll put them there to get to practice in the sand, so to speak.
Yeah, and of course with Italy now belligerent on the borders, the Palestinian Jews are feeling more vulnerable than ever. Yeah. So whereas before they'd been saying, why don't you let us have a Jewish division fight alongside Britain? Now they're saying, oh, hang on, please arm us inside Palestine so we can defend our own homes. There's a quote here from Chaim Weizmann at the time, and he says, Arab terrorists and Italian bombers can be expected any moment to start operations against our towns and settlements. Delay may mean the annihilation of the 500,000 Jews of Palestine. If we have to go down, we're entitled to go down fighting. And they're pressing more and more for this Jewish division. And indeed, in September 1940, the Italians do bomb Palestine. They bomb Haifa and Tel Aviv, and 125 people are killed in Tel Aviv. In Haifa, they're aiming for the docks, of course, and the oil refineries from the pipeline from Iraq. So Palestine is suddenly in the war. And at that point, people beginning to question, as we just said, the white paper, because if the white paper sort of made sense when you've got a European war, you want to keep the Arabs in the Middle East quiet. But you can't, as Anthony Eden said, the Germans can now always offer the Arabs more than we ever could on any white paper. The Germans can offer the extermination of Jews, which is, more than Haj Amin Husseini was ever going to get from the British. And on the other hand, if Britain is beating the Italians, they don't need to promise the Arabs anything because the Arabs will be quiet anyway because Britain's winning. So really, from June 1940, they realized that whatever they promised the Arabs isn't going to keep the Arabs quiet. The only thing that's going to keep them quiet is British victories, big British victories, and they need them fast. And of course, they're very thin on the ground at the beginning of the war. So, so they're very worried now what they're going to do. The white paper isn't fit for purpose because it's not helping with the Arabs, and it's also not helping with the Jews because all it's doing is antagonizing the Jews. And maybe the only reason they can't put a Jewish division in the field is because of this white paper. So possibly because of that. And but by October 1940, progress is now made towards a Jewish division. And what I'm showing you there in that picture is actually a poster from the First World War, which is when, as we talked about earlier, there had been a Jewish legion raised. And that later becomes the flag of the State of Israel. But at that point, it's a Zionist Jewish flag. And they set up a unit under that flag as the Jewish Legion in the British Army. And the United States flag there is significant because a large proportion of the soldiers of that legion were enlisted in the United States. And the idea is to do the same thing at the end of 1940, have a division is about 10,000 troops, 5,000 from Jews in the United States, about 5,000 from Palestine and other areas like Britain is the idea. And they think, well, okay, let's do this. And they make a lot of progress. Marching songs are written. They work out what pay they will have. They've worked out what the regimental banner should be for this Jewish division. And they also appoint Brigadier Hawes, who's going to take his position as head of this Jewish division in February 1941. But they decide that, crucially, there's a United States election in November 1940. And they think this isn't a great look for Roosevelt. He's trying to talk about neutrality. He's running on a ticket of keeping America out of the war. Should we really be trumpeting that we're going to take 5,000 American Jews and put them under British colors to fight? Maybe we should wait till after the election. And this gives time for people who are really against the Jewish division to marshal their arguments again. But at the moment, the most immediate thing that happens in the Middle East is that we finally do get General Wavell is head of the Middle East Command, and he finally does get victories. So there's a huge victory against the Italians in Egypt and pushing them out of Egypt, and then Libya. They captured Tobruk, and by February 1941, they've advanced around 500 miles, and this is going to keep the Arabs quiet. This maybe is the time to bring forward a Jewish division, and this is actually the closest it came for this part of the war. But what changes it is that it's at this time, as people will know maybe better than me, that Churchill decides that the victory has been so complete, they can now afford to take the troops out of North Africa who have done all of this and send them to Greece, because maybe we can help the Greeks there. And General Wavell, who has always been pro-white paper, he says, look, I've always been against this Jewish division. It will cause an Arab revolt. If you're telling me to take all my troops to Greece, I must have peace and quiet for 6 months. I don't want to have to worry about the Middle East. Please postpone a Jewish division. Or if you are going to grant a Jewish division, then as a quid pro quo, give the Arab Palestinians more independence in Palestine, as you promised in the white paper. And Churchill, who has always been exasperated with Wavell pretty much from the beginning, says, well, look, if Wavell says he needs peace and quiet, if that's what it needs for him to be all in on Greece, fine. We'll postpone a decision on the Jewish division for another 6 months. You go and take the soldiers you need and go and deal with Greece. But of course, from about March 1941, everything starts going the other way. And you find that Rommel starts moving with the Afrika Korps against weakened troops in North Africa. And this timeline shows that shortly after he's regaining most of what they'd lost, the Italians had lost just a couple of months earlier, the British are pushed out of Libya as well. And they're not doing well in Greece. As this sort of picture shows, they're not doing well in North Africa, Greece, or Crete. And they have to withdraw from Greece. And just as they're fighting at Greece, there is another problem in the Middle East. I mentioned earlier that the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, had fled from Palestine during the revolt to Beirut. He had then fled to Iraq, and he'd been stirring up anti-British sentiment there. And in April 1941, a pro-Nazi coup takes place in Iraq, which is also under Wavell's responsibility. And Wavell is thinking, I can't cope with all of this. I've got a problem in Greece. I've got a problem in North Africa. I didn't see Rommel coming. And now you want me to go and put down pro-Nazi revolt in Iraq. I don't have the troops, can't do it. Maybe we should appease the pro-Nazis in Iraq and just allow them to have a pro-Nazi government there. And other British people, like the Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, is just astonished. He thinks Wavell's gone mad. He thinks you can't allow a pro-Nazi government in Iraq sitting on our supply lines to India. What are you thinking of? And General Auchinleck, who is in control of the Indian army at that time, he's saying, of course we can't allow this rebellion to take hold. We have to defeat it. And he brings troops over from India to Basra in Iraq and starts threatening the pro-Nazi rebels there. And then eventually a small column is sent out from Palestine. It's called the King Cole column, and it arrives at the besieged RAF Air Force Base at Habaniyah in Western Iraq. But by the time it gets there, as this picture shows, the 2,000 or so cooks and trainees in Habaniyah had actually managed to defeat the defenders themselves. I think this painting shows Gloucester gladiators in the air there. They managed to use those to good effect. So the coup is put down, but it's all happening at the same time as we get this disaster in Crete as well. The British had been evacuated from Greece to Crete and were waiting further evacuation, which meant that the German airborne forces there didn't expect to have so many British to fight, and they were nearly decimated themselves in conquering Crete. And that would have some significance later on in this story here. But what's really important as far as the Palestinian Jews, the Yishuv, is concerned, is the 11th May on this timeline, where German fighter planes land in Baghdad to support the rebels. And they did that by refueling. Someone mentioned earlier Vichy France had taken up the Syrian and Lebanese mandates. So you have an antagonistic government, or at least a very cold neutral government sitting on Palestine's northern borders. And now, having said we're just neutral, we're not taking part, the British are saying, well, you've just let German planes land refueling on the way to Iraq. You're not neutral. And this was causing pressure on the Jewish community as well. And then once Crete itself is lost, it becomes panic stations in the Yishuv. And what also makes things pretty bad from a Jewish point of view is that there was a 2 or 3 day interregnum when the government of Iraq had fled from Baghdad, but the British soldiers hadn't gone in yet. And the reason they didn't go in yet is because they didn't want it to look like the Iraqi king was being put back on the end of British bayonets. They wanted to look like they were doing it without the British. But the Nazi sympathizers in Baghdad took that 3 day break to turn on the Jewish community of Baghdad. And there was a massacre there, which the British want to play down, because the whole point of the white paper was saying, it's fine, you can have a 1/3 minority under the Arabs in a Palestinian state. No harm will come to you. And then, so it really didn't suit their narrative that as soon as the Arabs got a chance, they killed about 700, it's hard to know the exact numbers, but several hundred Jews were butchered in Baghdad before order was restored. So this puts the Jews in Palestine in a real bind, because and this is a map of the time where I've superimposed some helpful arrows and icons. But you've got the Germans coming down through Yugoslavia and Greece here, and then they've parachuted into Crete. And you've got Rommel coming up on North Africa. But the way the Yishuv saw it at the time and spoke to the British about it is, not only have we got this, the Iraqi rebels in Baghdad and the refueling in Syria, but what is to stop the German airborne divisions doing what they did to Crete? They could take Cyprus next, and then they can land in Vichy, France, build up their forces there, and come into Palestine from the north. And we'll be caught between the German pincers with Rommel in the south. And airborne units don't only have to land in Vichy; they can land in Palestine directly and join the Arab rebels there and start attacking our settlements immediately. And of course, what they don't know, and what wasn't obvious to a lot of people, is that the losses the Germans suffered in Crete meant that this was never going to happen. The Germans didn't have enough of their airborne divisions left to be able to take Cyprus. But that wasn't known at the time, and this was a very real fear. And what really helps the British position in the Middle East when in the face of all of this, and what saves their position is Barbarossa in June 1941, because all German resources were being taken away from North Africa. Rommel was asking for more; he was getting less, and it also meant that Syria was basically going to be safe. The Vichy French could be there. They had about 35,000 Vichy soldiers there, but they weren't going to do anything. They were just sitting there. So Britain's position was very weak in May 1941. And if Hitler hadn't had his idealistic and ideological reasons for going for Russia and had concentrated on the Middle East, it might have been a very different story.
Two things I just want to kind of add. One is that this is the era, particularly for the Allies, but as you've made it clear, the Axis as well, as of robbing Peter to pay Paul. If they want to move forces into place B, they have to take them from place A. 2 or 3 years later, the Allies can do multiple operations in multiple theaters at the same time and still not really stretch their resources, but not in 41, not at this point. It's all about moving them from one place to another. And also, this is your presentation is absolutely poo-pooing the idea that the North African campaign has no effect on anything around the world. I mean, I've never believed that that's a nonsense idea. It's the Suez Canal, it's India, it's supplies to Australia, it's the Battle of the Atlantic, it's everything else. And Rob Charin just made the point in the sidebar there of Turkey playing a fine balancing game in the middle of all this as well. You know, Turkey, obviously beyond the scope of today's presentation, but they're sitting there watching what's going on as well, as indeed are other places.
Yeah, and Turkey will come into it more in part two, actually. Right. The other thing, you mentioned all of those really good points of why the Middle East was so important, but of course, Britain's oil was really coming from Iraq at that point. Yeah. Saudi Arabia was only just beginning to produce oil, but Iraq was a major source of oil for the British, and they couldn't really afford to lose that, despite what Wavell thought. So very quickly, I just want to finish talking about what effect all of this was happening on the Jewish community in the Yishuv. The Jewish Defense Force was called the Haganah. At that point, it was just local militias, so each kibbutz might have had a few armed men. The cities had a bit more, but they weren't really linked up. And when the Yishuv saw that the Germans were bearing down on them from both directions, they suddenly realized they weren't nearly organized enough. They could just about cope if there was an Arab insurrection, but if the British were to withdraw from Palestine, they thought that there would be a period of time when they would be under attack just from the Arabs before the Germans actually got there. And they wanted to last as long as possible because who knows, maybe the British would get reinforcements from India and they would only abandon Palestine for a short while. So they just needed to survive perhaps for a couple of months, but they needed a proper army of their own. So the knock-on effect of everything we've been talking today has a real impact on Jewish defense within Palestine. It hasn't managed to get a Jewish division. It is allowed to recruit into British units in the British Army, but there was this rule of parity that only the same number of Jews could enlist as Arabs. And of course, the Arabs weren't enlisting in high numbers to the British Army at all, which actually would turn out to be a strategic error for the Palestinian Arabs. But the British weren't allowing the Jews to enlist in any higher numbers. And if they did, for example, the Royal East Lancashire and Yeomanry and Pioneer regiments, Jews could go into there, but only as guardsmen. They weren't given frontline duties, frontline arms, frontline training. They could man anti-aircraft batteries in the RAF in Haifa, but they couldn't until around May 1941 be allowed to do any more. But as it began, May 41 becomes a real problem, and they realize the British are thinking for the first time, we may really need to have to evacuate Palestine. We may have to abandon 500,000 Jews to their fate. Maybe we should give a bit more to the local Jewish defense force, the Haganah. And they help the Jews. This is actually in Hebrew, but this little badge here says Palmach. It's the Palmach was the elite force of the Haganah, which was created at this time. And it was given British training. So only about 600 were supposed to be trained, but the Jews sort of rotated numbers. And in the end, probably 1,000 were trained without the British being clear that they were training different people all the time. So they got about 1,000 members of the Palmach who became well-armed, relatively well-trained. But that's a very small number if you're about to be invaded by Axis powers. But this is the beginning. This is effectively the beginning of the IDF. I think you could say, you might say it started a little bit earlier when some of their numbers, some of the very same people who later joined this fledgling Palmach, like Moshe Dayan, they had first joined in special night squads of the British in 1938-39 to help protect the oil pipeline that was being sabotaged by the Arab rebels. Those people got some military training, and they were led by Wingate, who later becomes famous in the Far East. In fact, he's regarded by Wavell as being so pro-Zionist that he can never serve in Palestine again, and he moves him to East Africa, where he does extremely well. He puts Haile Selassie back on the throne of Ethiopia and helps clear the Italians out of East Africa. He's then sent to Burma, as we know, and becomes a major general. But he gave the Jews their first taste of warfare, proper training, proper military training in tiny numbers. But now in 1941, they become organized, and the Palmach is the beginning of what would later become the IDF. And I think we can pretty much leave it there, but I just wanted to point out that in June 1941, just a few weeks after those German planes had landed on the way to Baghdad, Churchill says, enough's enough, we need to take Vichy out of Syria. And there is a 6-week campaign from June 1941 where the Australians mainly, with the help of some Arabs from the Transjordanian Frontier Force and from the fledgling Palmach, who act as guides because they know they've infiltrated Lebanon for months before finding out which paths and valleys are best to go through. So the British take Lebanon and Syria in June 1941, and for a few months, they breathe a sigh of relief that the pressure's off in the Middle East. And part 2 will show that that only lasts for a few months until
a bit of a false dawn. Yeah.
There's another pincer.
But brilliant stuff, Geoffrey. And just in this time when the people who are staying in Palestine, the Jewish people there, are wanting to establish their own army division, is there any other means of Jewish young men going and participating in the war via the means? Are they able to get out and, I don't know, join the Free French or get to the UK? Has there been a trickle of other people being able to go and serve? I mean, I know that doesn't help Palestine directly, but has there been something like that going on as well?
Yeah, so Jews in England have also flocked to the colours, and they join the British Army, but obviously not as distinct Jewish units, but as Jews within the British Army. And the British were always happy to encourage that. They just didn't want a Jewish independent force fighting under its own flag because of the politics. Whereas the Jews in Palestine will say, well, we have to now. We have to defend our own homeland. Later on, a bit, almost just starting after this, the Jews from Palestine are used as paratroopers into Eastern Europe to try and support the partisans in Yugoslavia, and to try and use Jewish communities in Eastern Europe as to fight against the Germans. Of course, at that time, they don't realize what the Holocaust means, that you can't really organize Jewish units in the way that they thought they might have been able to in 1941. But that said, many Jews do fight as Jewish partisan units behind Russian lines and with the help of the Soviets. So there will be Jewish Palestinian paratroopers into Eastern Europe. Some of them will survive. Many of them will be captured. There is also Jewish attempts to set up clandestine radio networks to help the British in Yugoslavia. And before they took over from Vichy, France, in Lebanon and Syria, Jewish units had infiltrated there to help the British with intelligence.
Okay. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions that may or may not be for today or maybe for part 2 when that comes. Trevor Sheehan, who is our Tunisia expert, was the area used as part of Persian command for Lend-Lease goods going to Russia, or did it all go through Iran?
Short answer is I think it all went through Iran. It didn't touch on Palestine.
Okay, thank you. And Michael Dunn said, how was the Arab Legion in Transjordan viewed under General John Bagot Glab, viewed as an immediate threat or as a professional outfit under British officers?
I'm not sure. Immediate threat to who? I'm not sure. Do you mean to the Jews or to the British?
I guess he means both, or either. However you want to answer it, I guess.
So whereas Iraq, I guess the most pro-British area of the entire Middle East was the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan, or Emirate as it was then, because Abdullah owed his throne to the British, and as it shows in the question, it was the Arab Legion was British officered. It too was a very tiny force. It wasn't really known as the Arab Legion then. It was the Transjordanian Frontier Force, and they did help a little bit. When I talked about the King Cole column to help Habanir, but actually they also mutinied when they were asked to fight against the Iraqi rebels. A large part of the Transjordanian force just went home and said it wasn't going to fight. Which sort of backed up the Jewish contention that they were the only allies that you could really rely on. Britain, please look at us. So later on in 1948, it is a proper Arab Legion, but that's outside the scope of this.
Yeah, so let's go. We'll bring you back for part 2. But just before we bring things to a close, I often ask historians, how does it work in terms of archives and access and documentation? Because is this something that it's easy to find archives in the current state of Israel, or are you finding stuff in British archives? What's the main source for all this information? I mean, for example, the graphs and things you've got. How was the process?
So three main sources, I suppose. One was the National Archives have all the Foreign Office and Colonial Office arguments and the Cabinet Office documents. In Israel, there's the Central Zionist Archives in Jerusalem, which has all everything that the Yishuv was doing at that time. Right. So a lot of that's in Hebrew, but also when the British left in 1948, they didn't take all their documentation with them. So a lot of British documents, some of which were duplicated in the National Archives, but others which weren't, are also at the Central Zionist Archives. And the third source was that, so for example, those graphs, the British had some very detailed annual reports throughout its mandate years of the mandate of Transjordan and of Palestine, giving huge details of immigration, religion, education. And that was another great source. But dotted around Britain are other sources. There's Anthony Eden's diaries that were given to Birmingham University, and Manchester University has Auchinleck's papers. So, but then if you want the Australian division in Lebanon and the unusual relationship the Australian politicians had, they had a presence in the British cabinet during the war. So Australian documents in Canberra are also very useful. They're all online, which is very helpful.
Yeah. Okay, well, we will leave it there, except to say that we're all looking forward to part 2, because yeah, and I'm glad we split it, because there's a lot of different stages and sequences of this. So I think it was good. It was wise to split it over 2 parts, let people decompress and take on board what it is. But as someone said very early on, this is exactly the kind of show that World War II TV does, that I'm very proud that we do, because yes, it's all very well talking about Arnhem and Midway and the Battle of Britain, which we do a lot, but it's these other things that, as you've mentioned, that it's the sinews, it's the spider's web of connections to this, that the possibilities and the what ifs and the butterfly effect, if you like, of one event here potentially influencing something else there, and just for the people who are there, the threat of imminent death from different areas and different peoples and different directions that has been so fascinating. So brilliant. Folks, the link to the book is in the description below, or you can order it wherever you get your books. So it's sort of the website says September, but it is available to order now, is from what I understand looking up today.
It came out in the UK on 20th of August. It's due out in the United States in September. Okay, there we are. Super. So, folks, I think you know what to do. Go and get this. But we're back again tomorrow. More shows coming your way. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. And I will see you all tomorrow. Thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you, viewers. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.